In order to get rid of parasites in our body, you don't need to constantly take medications or follow exhausting diets. You just need to create conditions in which they feel uncomfortable in our body and they will leave on their own. This is Dr. Vasyl Chaika with you. Let's sort this issue out together. According to statistics, every third person on the planet has problems with parasites living in their body. And there are mainly three classes of these so-called parasites, or as they're also called, worms, right? There are the so-called roundworms. These are the names you've most often heard. The most common are pinworms and ascarids. There are also so-called flatworms, and the most common representatives, you've heard of them too, are the beef and pork tapeworms. There are also so-called flukes. A representative of this group is the Opistorchis. So why do these parasites appear in our bodies? What has to go wrong with us for these parasites to start using our bodies as their home? These microorganisms appear in our bodies and consider it their home only when they feel comfortable living here. In other words, something happens in our body, something changes, and this creates comfortable conditions for these microorganisms. Remember that very simple saying, right? For example, about worms in the garden. Worms won't just appear there on their own. There have to be certain conditions for that. What kind of conditions? It's organic matter. So, if there's organic matter, worms will appear. If there's no organic matter, there won't be any worms, they'll leave. Let's figure out what happens in our body that creates the optimal conditions for parasites to appear. Our body, as a biological system, a self-renewing system, has a huge number of defense mechanisms. So the very first line of defense to prevent anything from living inside us is our stomach. Our stomach secretes hydrochloric acid. And in addition to that, it also produces a substance, an enzyme called pepsin. These two substances create such an aggressive environment that they serve as the first barrier, preventing microorganisms with so-called protective protein shells from penetrating further into the body. Therefore, if, for example, we have reduced acidity, decreased production of gastric juice, or decreased production of pepsin, this first protective barrier begins to disappear. The second protective barrier is the secretion of bile. It is bile that after everything has been burned, for example, by acid, and if something survives, say something with a fatty membrane or some other kind of membrane, it can get through because the acid doesn't affect them. Then bile comes into play, creating a very alkaline environment, that is a sharp change in conditions, and bile also prevents these worms from developing there. The next element is peristalsis, meaning the contractions of the intestine, which are directly stimulated by bile. And so even if this microorganism does get in, it can be quickly evacuated before it has a chance to create optimal conditions for itself there. In other words, it gets stunned twice and then quickly thrown out. If these three mechanisms do not work effectively, then optimal conditions arise for the development of these worms. So what are the causes that lead to this? After all, we're told, oh look, most often it's animals that are to blame for all this because they infect us. Or no, it's children because, for example, they're weak, they go to groups and they don't wash their hands. So it's always some external reason. You need to clearly understand that we live on planet Earth, where we are surrounded by a huge number of microorganisms and our bodies have protective adaptive mechanisms. If these mechanisms work, no problems arise. But if, for example, a person does not consume protein foods, for instance, if they want to be a vegetarian or a vegan, that is their choice. But in this case, if they consume more plant-based proteins instead of animal proteins, the secretion of hydrochloric acid and pepsin itself decreases. What does this lead to? It means that the first protective barrier is reduced. If, for example, a person does not consume animal fats and only follows a plant-based diet, what will this lead to? This also reduces bile secretion, meaning the second barrier is also diminished. Yes, peristalsis might still function, but the first two protective barriers are not working. Then, for example, when a person is under some kind of psycho-emotional overload, stress, as we say, we constantly have it at work, problems arise and the person reacts to them. What does this lead to? To hyperactivation of the sympathetic nervous system. What will this result in? In a spasm of the stomach. In this case, hydrochloric acid is not secreted and the secretion of pepsin decreases. What will this result in? Once again, the first protective barrier begins to suffer. If we are constantly experiencing anger, aggression, unpleasantness, and so on, the bile ducts will also suffer. So both physical and emotional factors create conditions that are comfortable for microorganisms to thrive. Let's now go over the mistakes people make when they want to help themselves get rid of parasites. So the first mistake is that people think if they stop eating, the parasites will die off on their own. No. Remember, parasites will not die from this. You will only make things worse for yourself because they feed, there is plenty for them to eat in the intestines. And if that's not enough for them, then they will start consuming you. That's it. This is normal for them. So starvation doesn't work here. The second mistake is thinking that if we stop eating sweets, because worms are attracted to sweets. If we limit, for example, carbohydrates for children, it will supposedly lead to them not having worms. This is yet another myth. It doesn't work. Whether you eat sweets or not, it doesn't affect worms at all. Their lives don't change in any way. They don't feed on sugar. Worms don't need sugar. The third myth is that if I constantly disinfect my hands and keep everything clean, I won't get worms. No, that's not true, because worm eggs are found on the skin of pets. They float in the air. In other words, all of this surrounds you. This biological world is all around you, and there's no need to be afraid of it. What you need to do, as I said before, is create optimal conditions for yourself, and then there won't be any problems. So how do people fight these parasites? And here there is a huge number of different kinds of recommendations. There's some exotic herb, or for example, some foreign pill. So if we take it, if we drink it, all the parasites will disappear. And that's the only one you need to take. Or for example, some kind of super tincture. And or for example, people often say, for instance, cognac with castor oil helps. Someone else says, no, it's better to use black cumin oil. Others say, no, you need to use blind intubation and chase them out with these blind intubations. That is, there are so many different kinds of recommendations, and a person just doesn't know which ones to choose. But all of this is a myth. Because if you understand how your body works and how to create the right conditions, then parasites simply won't be able to live in your body. They may enter it. They can get into it, but they won't be able to survive there because you will create unfavorable conditions for them. Let's break down what needs to be done. So what should you do from the perspective of a comprehensive approach? So the first thing we need to start with is not to urgently drink, eat, or take something right away because we feel like we're dying, or for example, worms are eating us. First, we need to create optimal conditions for ourselves. Worms are just as much representatives of living microorganisms as we are. They have lived on this planet even longer than we have. That's it. Once again, there is no point in fighting them. We need to change the conditions of their existence. And we should start with the emotional component. If there is anger in our lives, if there is aggression, if there are constant troubles, meaning we react emotionally and on top of that, suppress these emotions, what does this lead to? It leads to stomach spasms, impaired bile flow, and disrupted digestion. In other words, we reduce the effectiveness of the barriers that exist. That's why the first thing we need to do is learn how to respond to this world, to accept it as it is. Where do we start? With the understanding that there are no bad people. For example, when a father yells at his child, the father is not a bad person. The father simply doesn't know any other way. This needs to be explained to the child. When a teacher, for example, gives a bad grade because they want to punish the student, it's not because the student is bad. The teacher just doesn't know any other way. No one ever taught them either. Yes, they may be ruining someone's fate. Well, in that case, you can change schools. You see? We need to find environments where we won't constantly be expressing our anger and aggression. Occasionally, that's fine. But if we constantly live in these conditions, nothing good will come of it. We'll never get rid of the emotional component. Additionally, when there is understanding, we can also use physical methods that improve this process and reduce the emotional component. For example, warm salt baths. So what is recommended for children? Every day in the evening, let them spend 15 to 20 minutes soaking in a warm bath so they can relax, right? Adults can also take baths. Adults can meditate. Adults can also use other methods to reduce emotional stress. It is extremely important to do this every day. Some people can just go for a walk, some can go for a run, and others can simply do something enjoyable for themselves. In other words, we are reducing the significance of the emotional component. The next step is to start taking agents that stimulate the secretion of gastric juice and bile and activate our peristalsis. What stimulates the secretion of hydrochloric acid and pepsin? Of course, simple protein. So if you don't consume protein, if you limit animal proteins, your secretion of hydrochloric acid will decrease. And no matter what you do, no matter what you drink or eat, nothing plant-based will work. Therefore, animal proteins. And how many of them should you eat? 1 gram per kilogram. To make you comfortable, the next step is to stimulate the outflow of bile. What can we use for this? And here our arsenal is simply unlimited. Everything you've ever heard about effectively treating various types of worms, such as using a triad or wormwood or castor oil or even some specific nuts and so on. All of these proposed remedies are either intensely bitter or excessively fatty or noticeably sour, or they contain strong pungent spices. So the essence of all this treatment comes down to one thing: stimulating the outflow of bile. In other words, if bile is constantly flowing properly and hydrochloric acid is being synthesized, parasites cannot survive in your body. That's why every day you should consume something spicy, something bitter, something sour. Some people might take herbs like wormwood or a herbal blend. Some might eat pumpkin seeds. Some might eat viburnum berries. Others might eat nuts. It doesn't matter at all. You should consume these substances little by little every day. And what will they do? They will stimulate bile flow and create conditions that are unfavorable for these parasites to survive. This will also enhance peristalsis. And when these parasites are already stunned, plus rapid evacuation from the intestines, they can't even develop a defense. So they may enter your body, but they won't be able to survive in it. That's why in Eastern countries, what is popular? Spicy food. Because this practice is part of their culture. It's a way to prevent helminth infestations. In our culture, it's onions, garlic, pumpkin seeds, and even dandelion. So all of this is right at our feet. There's no need to bring something from somewhere else, and so on. But what about children, you might ask? So what should children do then? Children can't eat that much spicy food. They don't need to eat a lot. Remember, you should eat just enough to feel comfortable, and not just eat. Before that, you also need to address the emotional component. If you don't do this and start using stimulants, it will lead to you feeling unwell because your gates will be closed. For example, bile doesn't flow out, you stimulate it, and the pressure increases. You get a headache, you start to feel nauseous, you vomit. In other words, you're just doing everything wrong because you think there's some miracle method that kills parasites. Nothing actually affects parasites. There are no remedies that kill them, they can only paralyze their nervous system. But bile, for example, prevents them from reproducing, meaning that the eggs of parasites that are scalded by bile, what happens to them? Nothing will hatch from them. So in this way, the same applies to giardiasis. But how can giardia live in the bile ducts? Because there is bile stagnation there. That's why any proper prevention and treatment of giardiasis is the same. How does it start? By stimulating bile flow. Without this, nothing will work. I want you to understand this very clearly. So use these simple recommendations and remember, there are no miracle drugs. All the medicine is right under your feet. So when you use the nature that surrounds you and live in harmony, no parasites will be able to survive in your body. Only a thinking person in today's world can be healthy,